Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today we have an extremely special guest, Julia Keleher. She is currently the founder and CEO of Solution Partners, who manages experts in closing the strategy execution gap. She was the former secretary of the Puerto Rico Department of Education under the Ricardo Rosselló administration. During her tenure, she was instrumental in implementing ambitious reforms aimed at improving the island's public education system. Her efforts included modernizing the curriculum, enhancing teacher training, and increasing access to quality education for all students. Her career was also marked by complexity and controversy. In 2019, she faced legal challenges and spent 6 months in prison, where she continued her educational efforts working with other inmates. Despite these challenges, Julia remains a passionate advocate for students and educators. She continues to work as a consultant and speaker, sharing her insights on educational leadership, policy, and reform. Her dedication to making a difference in the lives of students, coupled with her experiences and the complexities she has navigated, make her a compelling and multifaceted figure in the field of education. I'm so excited for today's conversation. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak with
Am I slowly getting better at reading? I feel like it's been a
you.
process. Every episode, I'm like, I am going to read it perfectly, and I'm almost there.
Yes, yes, yes. I think the cadence, what I noticed was it was something nice about your both your voice and the cadence.
Oh,
Yeah.
thanks. Yeah, I mean, no, reading, it's one of those things that's actually so challenging. I think when you don't read out loud often, when I'm just like reading
Mhm.
to my head. So even if I make a mistake when I'm reading to myself, I'm like, all right, it's fine. But when you read out loud, it's
Right.
challenging.
Yeah.
Um, and so, I'm really excited for today's conversation. I just think you have such a rich history and career, and you've seen and done so many different things that I think I'm just really excited to kind of hear your experiences and perspectives on things. So the first question, which I think is the favorite question for a lot of people to be asked in the space of education, is how did you even get here? How did you get interested in working with education?
Mhm. I'm not sure if it's similar to others' experience, but for me, it goes back to my childhood experiences. So
Hmm.
I grew up in an Italian American community in South Philadelphia. And I didn't know it at the time, but I didn't speak standard English as a child. It wasn't, broken English like with an accent. It wasn't, how other people may have sounded in the community, but it wasn't the standard English. And I think it reflected sort of the challenges that many of my neighbors and friends had when we went to school. We came from humble beginnings, and we weren't maybe as prepared as other students. Um, and there were teachers who I met along my journey that took the time to invest in me, to give extra help, to provide
Mm,
a resource or to refer me to a program, right? And so um, I didn't realize it at the time, but by the time I went to college, when I felt completely unprepared to compete with everyone else who was there, I realized what that trajectory had been. And I said, wow, if it weren't for those teachers, I wouldn't have made it out. Statistically, I should have just stayed in that zip code, maybe moved 2 blocks over, and that would have been it for my life. And so I felt that because someone had cared enough to give me an opportunity, that I wanted to dedicate myself to a career that ensured there was one more adult, in the system that was looking out and trying to make sure that children had accesses to the resources that would help them thrive.
mm. Do you feel like your experiences so when you say not broken English, but I'm curious, what was that? What was it that you were referring to there?
So for example, if you see somebody around 4 o'clock, and I'm giving you a context clue there, right? Would you say G yet? No, Jew. Like, what is that? That's like JEET. Yet?
Hmm.
No, JEW.
Mm.
Did you eat yet? Have you eaten? No, I haven't.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? That's
Yeah,
it's
got
not
it.
it's not broken English in the sense like what traditionally if it's the English where the English is actually broken, the words are broken. It's just a phonetically different sound system that's
Mm.
conveying, but it's non-standard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which makes it hard if you're going to learn to write, which
Yeah.
makes it hard if you're looking for sounds as a kid when you're learning your letters and to read. You're associating things differently than what standard English asks you to do. So it
Mm.
puts you at a little bit of a, you're at a different starting place.
Yeah. And so you knew because you ended up going to your master's in education. So you knew from a young age that education was kind of the space that you wanted to be in.
I knew by the time I got to college, I knew by like 18, that I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to do something that was education related, that was adding to sort of the knowledge base and kind of aligned with that. And then when you start to learn, when you have to make choices about your major and what's your
Mm-hmm.
internship going to be, all those things start to fall in place. I got interested in policy, and I got interested in Spanish also in college. So policy, I did an internship in Washington D.C. At when Clinton had just started the Corporation for National Service. So that was, but again, it's national, it's service. Like teaching is a service profession, right? It's like how do you give back to the community? And then I did a semester in Spain, my last year in school. So I spent the 4 years really trying to learn Spanish. I didn't speak it well. I don't really think I still, some would argue I still don't speak it well, but by the time I left Puerto Rico, I spoke it much better than I did when I got there.
Mm. It's interesting. So I'm curious because when I think about education, I think there's so many aspects in which you can approach it. You can approach it from the policy perspective, so really understand, what is it that's happening? How are we legislating education? I think that's one aspect
Hmm.
of it. Another side is like thinking about it pedagogically. How is it that we teach things? Are there ways that we can teach things better? There's another aspect that's like more psychology based. How do people learn? There's also
Hmm.
the philosophical part of like what is the purpose of learning? How did you kind of figure out which questions you were most interested? Because I think you approached it a lot more practically and politically than you did like pedagogically or philosophically, right?
So yeah, I think it's like most things and like most of the work that I'm doing now, sort of trying to be a multi-solver, right? So look at a problem on multiple dimensions. I am a big believer in, systems theory, and I think that um, complex issues require very well designed, intricate solutions to fit the
Mm,
nuances of those contexts. So I think it you have to have some policy and legislative guardrails. You have to have some structural support. My undergrad was
mm,
political science. My minor was in Latin American studies. When I went to and got my master's in education, it was in education psychology. So it really was, how do children learn? What are the things that interfere with how children learn? What are supports and structures you can put in place to change the learning environment? So that gets to the sort of the practitioner side of it. And I think my first set of teaching experience in Philadelphia was in 1990. It started in 96, 97, 97 in North Philadelphia, working in the Puerto Rican community. I had built a relationship previous years there, and so I went to be what was called a family community liaison. And at that time, they didn't have a lot of bilingual materials. You know how now, like everywhere you go,
yeah.
you can get information in multiple languages. If you've gotten something from like the healthcare company, there's that second page that
Yes.
has, it's just the same message in multiple languages. But in, the late 90s, they didn't offer that. And so I was trying to build a bridge, which I think speaks to the social aspect, like the socioeconomics of education and what education opportunity really mean. Because if families can't engage with the school because they don't speak the language, you're excluded by default because you actually have no way of engaging. And then when I went to teach in a middle school, I was a guidance counselor and I taught a careers class, which is also a non-traditional class. You had mixed levels and you're teaching career exploration. What do you want to be when you grow up and why is school relevant? So I feel like my pathway sort of touched on all of those
Mm.
different types of the different aspects of education that you very astutely named.
That's I have my brain is exploding with flashbacks. Okay, so this idea you mentioned problem solving and problems, right? I think this is such a fascinating thing. It was only when I got to policy school did I realize how simple often our solutions are to these really complex issues because I just think it takes like a lack of nuanced thinking when it comes to some of
Hmm.
these things. Like,
Hmm.
I mean, if you hear education discourse, I mean, some of the solutions people propose are just so simple without really considering what the complexities of both sides of any given solution
Hmm.
is. And so,
Hmm.
first, before we even get into Puerto Rico, I'm really curious to kind of talk about this and the process of figuring out, first of all, what is a problem? What does it mean for something to be a problem? I think is a great question. And
Hmm.
then after that,
Hmm.
what is the process that you take when you think of how to come up with the solution? And what are some of the biggest shortcomings that you've seen in how failed approaches take?
Um, so I think a problem could be defined, different people who sit in different seats and have different vantage points. They have their own individual definition of what a problem is, right? And
Mm,
so what I am going to say may or may not cover the universe of what a problem could be. But what comes to mind are a few ways of describing it. One is it's a problem as an impediment to the realization of some objective. So you have in education you have a child, and we want that child to develop to their potential, and something's interfering with that. There's something's not
mm,
working in the system. That's why is that a problem? And problem has a negative connotation in English, but it's a problem is something the verb that goes with it, right? Is to solve. You solve a problem. So it's a problem is something that has some kind of flexibility, some kind of malleability that we can do something to
mm,
it to make it different. So
mm,
in that sense, you have people looking at what's happening for the children and saying, "Oh, the child isn't able to realize their potential. That's a problem. Something's interfering with that. What do we do to free up the child's ability to realize their potential?" A problem from another perspective might be that person A doesn't like what person B is doing, and it becomes a problem, right? So that is not something um, to unlock or to open up. It's something to stop, right? That's a problem.
mm,
I want to stop that, right? So I think it just depends on, again, like I said, and I can't name the because it's probably infinite the way that this could be defined, but it's based on sort of who are the actors and what is the desired goal. And then I think to answer your second question about how do I, what's a process for identifying it and solving it, I would go back to systems theory, which um, I I I think every individual probably has their own orientation or preference in terms of how they understand the world and how it works. So I was probably inclined to adopt this theory when I first learned about it because it really resonated with it. Kind of made the world that I understood make sense. So I don't I was sort of predisposed to like it. But the model is from Yuri Bronfenbrenner, and he's the individual who modeled Head Start. And the idea is that if we think of concentric circles, you have a child, right? And a child lives in a home or a family, and that family is on a street in a neighborhood, and that neighborhood is in a community, right? And so as you move further out, it's possible to draw a line from across the concentric circles to see the influence
mm,
of different factors on that child's development. Distance from the child may or may not indicate degree of impact.
mm,
As for example, if a youth is has an interaction with the police, which is going to be on an outer ring, right? It doesn't have to be exactly in their community. That's going to have a significant impact on
mm,
their life, right? But it's also if they don't have food or heating in their house, that's gonna, so
mm,
the way that I tend to look at the world is through an interaction of elements in a system that are interrelated parts, and it is about sequencing the levers to move in a way that create optimal conditions that then alleviate the challenge the problem was or the obstacle the problem was that represents. That's
mm,
how I think about it. Now, I will also say that that description, you indulged me in giving the sort of very uh, heady kind of um, what I find to be just sort of a beautiful thought. Like I like
Yeah.
thinking like that. I will say one of my weaknesses has been as a leader is to not be able to simplify the complex
Mm,
sufficiently to make that notion readily accessible.
mm,
It's too long, it's too involved. I got to get to the point. Like, what does it mean? And so I would apply system thinking and look at all the factors that are going to impact the thing we're trying to change, right? And how they work together. But I really, as a weakness, I would say I don't do a good job being simple or straightforward enough in saying what I mean to say. So thank you for indulging me.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, it's something I've really learned through this podcast of, I started out with the simple question. I mean, really, it was really just like, what is the purpose of learning? What is the purpose of
Hmm.
education? And from that one question, I have now found that it is involved with every other aspect of human life, whether it's
Hmm.
media, whether it's the economy, whether it's, I mean, it's endless. The
Hmm.
how involved actual education reform is mind blowing to me now. It requires so many moving parts, which is this kind of this concept of system thinking. So I
Hmm.
guess one question I have for you, and I've seen this in a lot of people, sometimes it can feel overwhelming because you're like,
Hmm.
okay, this can't be solved with just one easy fix. It has to be so overwhelming and societal sometimes that it's not going to be done in 1 day or 2 days. So,
Hmm.
how do you help yourself to not be overwhelmed sometimes by the largeness of some of these problems and
Hmm.
still, even though you're thinking about it from a systems level, come down to the day by day to figure out what you can do that day to improve
Yeah.
it?
One thing that people say helps is being able to zoom in and out. Can you see the party from the balcony and can you see it from the dance floor? That's not
Mm,
that's a Harvard Business Review sort of you know quick tip. And I didn't make it up, so I can't claim ownership to that. But the idea is just to be able to move back and forth with fluidity from the big picture to the immediate situation, and then try to change the things that you can. So we had in the middle school that I was in Wilmington, Delaware, there were 750 students. I I knew the majority of them, and I didn't touch every one of them and help them in some way. But then there were some that I know that were you know felt that someone believed in them and that made a difference. So
mm.
you go back and you do it every day, just kind of on faith.
Hmm. Be in the party and watch it. I like that. I actually like that. Yeah, it's a
Hmm.
nice analogy. So, you've been working in education for a bit, and then you got interested in you were working in a Puerto Rican community. How did that
Hmm.
then connect you into getting in touch with the governor? Is that correct? And then
Yeah.
how did you end up working in Puerto Rico?
So from 19 well, so with this first my when I was doing my master's, so from 1997 through 2000, I worked in the Puerto Rican community in North Philadelphia with serving this liaison role, connecting families who couldn't speak English or didn't feel comfortable engaging and finding ways to develop plans that would ensure that their children had the academic or instructional supports that they needed to be successful. And then after 3 years of that, I moved to Wilmington, Delaware, and I worked at the only bilingual middle school in Red Clay, and I was responsible for the what wasn't called ESL, it was the LSP program then, but I had you know I was selected because I spoke Spanish, so we did
Hmm.
work with families who didn't speak English, and then we served the general population. We also implemented in that in AI Middle, we implemented a Gear Up program, which was designed to and the school was majority minority. It was a Title I school. Um, and it was a program to increase access to Algebra 1 in eighth grade. So we provided accelerating learning opportunities for students who traditionally wouldn't be found in those classes to get them into this Algebra 1 credit for eighth grade because that had, it boded better for what their high school experience would be.
Hmm.
Then from there, I moved to the bilingual high school and I was the assistant principal and I supervised the ESL teachers and the bilingual classes. and did their evaluations. And then I also managed the caseload that was the Spanish speaking population. And then I moved on to the district level. I implemented it was the time when state testing and George Bush's sort of No Child Left Behind was kind of closing down schools, and people were trying to figure out what to do. And so the district needed to implement an alternative assessment program. And so we moved towards a growth model, which is really, I think, a great concept. Instead of tests right now, standardized tests tell you what a child does or doesn't know. So you test in third grade on standards 1 through 10. And if you fail the test, the teacher actually doesn't get any information about what you do know. She's just pretty clear, or he's pretty clear on what you don't know because you didn't pass the test. But this adaptive test was delivered on a computer, and it moderated the difficulty level of the question, so that if you were, you answered 2.5 correct, they move you to 2.6, and they jump you to 3, and you do okay 3, they move you to 3.3. Oh, you didn't get that, you move down 3.1. And so the teacher gets much better diagnostic information. So we did that, and that was really helpful because it's all about differentiating the learning, right? It's about figuring out what the individual student needs and trying to be able to customize what they're accessing to scaffold support so that they can then reach the standards.
Mm.
And then from there, I was writing the restructuring plans for the schools that needed to close in the district, and I had applied for a job at the U.S. Department of Education. So in 2007, I moved to D.C., and I was assigned Puerto Rico as my first assignment. I mean, I hadn't even been there very long, but again, because I spoke Spanish, they asked me to be on the team that was working to address the compliance issues. Now, that compliance agreement that was in place in 2007 was a result of the arrest of Victor Fajardo, who was a former Secretary of Education, who was found with, somewhere between $3 and $4 million. I don't remember the exact number, either in his refrigerator or under his bed or somewhere, So they had, the U.S. Department of Education had serious concerns about like the internal controls in Puerto Rico. So we worked, I led that. I eventually wound up leading the Title I team, and they satisfied the compliance agreement. So by I think it was 2011, we had demonstrated that Puerto Rico had kind of improved its operations. And then I worked for 2 more years there at the U.S. Department of Education, and then I left and started my first consulting company. And and at that point, they changed the school accountability law. It became the school states were applying for flexibility waivers because they hadn't been able to pass ESSA yet in the Senate, but Secretary Duncan had provided these flexibility waivers. So states were writing for this way of changing from the No Child Left Behind structure. So Puerto Rico engaged me to assist with the development of that plan, which we wrote and was approved, and I supported the implementation of. So all of my work, what I'm saying in short order is all of my work from 2007 to 2016 was ensuring the compliant functioning of the Department of Education in Puerto Rico as per the requirements of the U.S. Department of Education. So that's almost 10 years of, making sure that, and it was working, right? Because the department had satisfied the compliance agreement. They approved the flexibility plan. Like everything was not perfect, but not, not at so far below the standard. So anyway, so then when the governor-elect Rosselló, in 2016, he reached out to say that he thought that I would be a good choice to be secretary. And I thought that was a terrible idea.
And then what convinced you to take the position?
It was about probably 6 weeks of back and forth. And I reached out to literally every Spanish speaking school administrator that I knew to get resumes, to refer people, like I can help, let's find someone for the job. And, sort of they were unwilling to select another candidate, or didn't find a candidate that they thought would have experience on the ground, speak Spanish, know the department, know the federal requirements. And we got to a point where it was a lot of soul searching. I had just purchased a home in Georgetown, like literally in October. And I said, my whole career has been built on trying to improve access and create equity and an equal playing field for non-English speaking learners, right? Particularly people from the Puerto Rican community. And someone was saying there's a chance to change the system and make it better for almost 400,000 kids. And I struggled. I struggled with the decision of saying, well, I don't want to encumber my life. I really don't want the hassle. Can somebody else do it? Can't somebody else, take it on? And just saying it's not my problem. And I don't think I'm sort of built that way. So
Mm,
because we couldn't find someone else to do it, I I I felt that, and it needed to be done. It clearly needed to be done. It is what I think the crisis in Puerto Rico around education is, in my opinion, a humanitarian crisis that's been going on for 3 generations. Um, you know, who is it for me to say no?
mm,
And is that who I am? So I said yes. And I think the the thing that I there were many reasons why I felt like it wasn't a good idea. My Spanish isn't that good. I didn't work in the system. I don't know people over there. Like there were just a lot of like practical things that made it complicated. But I think the biggest missed um, opportunity to really understand the dynamics was when I failed to recognize that Puerto Rico has been a colony of the United States for 100 plus years, and a white woman coming from the States to take over a school system, and she doesn't have a real connection to those communities, um, didn't was disrespectful. It wasn't intentionally disrespectful. Like I didn't realize that was, would be offensive or could be offensive. But in hindsight, I should have demonstrated more respect to understand that like who the people who send their children to public schools want the leader of that public school to reflect their interests, their desires. They want to, you know what I mean? They want to pick
mm-hmm,
them, you know?
mm-hmm,
And I didn't, and putting me in that seat denied them the opportunity to have voice and agency in who's running the school system, which
mm,
is how most school systems here in the States run. They do a search, the board makes a decision, you know what I mean? There's an interview process. There's like a lot more public accountability.
mm.
So that's how I got to Puerto Rico.
Mm. I mean, it's fascinating when we look back. I'm not there yet, but as I'm getting older and older, I feel like it's fascinating to kind of trace back how we got to where we are today by all these like random, situations that were
Yeah.
just coincidental, and then all of a sudden they lead to something completely different.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that's one of the beauties of life. But, I'm really excited to kind of shift gears and focus a little bit more on Puerto Rico. So you talked a little bit about this education crisis as you were heading there.
Hmm.
I'm really interested to kind of get a better understanding of like what were some of the things that you saw that makes you want to call it an education crisis?
Hmm. So, um, the data alone, right? The data from the national data, like NAEP scores, have Puerto Rico uh, consistently at the bottom of the list. And they only test in math because they don't test in reading because the reading test is in English. Um, you know, on average for reading Spanish, English as a second language, and math, between 30 and 40% of the students are passing. So 3 out of 10 children can do math on grade level. I mean, that's something's not working right if those are the results that we're getting, and we're never getting any better. So I think the achievement, just if you look at the outcomes, right? And you look at
Mm,
other districts, then districts that are successful and districts that have been successful with similarly situated kids, if you compare districts in the on the continental United States. So the outcomes don't look great. But when you go into a school, and it's such a juxtaposition, and I think a lot of things about my experience sort of were seemingly contradictory. Um, you go into a school where there are warm, loving, caring, happy to be there teachers, who are trying to make the best of a situation, right? So you've got a great human, got a lot of great humans in there. But you go in and sometimes the lights aren't working, so the students are having class in the dark. There aren't any textbooks. There hadn't been a significant textbook purchase or adoption since 2008, so it was almost 10 years, and that was just in social studies. Children don't have workbooks. There's not little libraries in the classrooms. There aren't computer labs. There's not access to technology. Forget about a one-to-one device. The Wi-Fi in the school doesn't work. I mean, these are just conditions that you see in an average school in the United States. So what is that? Why do I find that as being unacceptable? Is because a child who's given subpar learning conditions is going to have a difficult time competing with their peers who are given access to more. And that access to more, there should be like a minimum standard of what public education in the United States provides you. Yet these children aren't, children in Puerto Rico were systematically not being given those things. Photocopiers don't work. There's the schools can be, they're not air conditioned classrooms. Some of the newer schools were air conditioned, but the windows don't open. So when the electricity goes out, which the electricity goes out a lot in Puerto Rico, the windows don't open. So you've got learning conditions where children aren't just comfortable, where they feel, when we think about the kind of school environment we want, a learning environment we want to send someone to, it's bright, it's inviting, it doesn't have
Yeah.
bars on it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this stands in stark contrast again to the beautiful people who are there trying to make the best. I mean, the teachers in Puerto Rico should be, I think, recognized nationally for their ability to deliver instruction in circumstances and without the lack in challenging circumstances and without the lack of resources. So you look around and you see these things. Now that if that wasn't enough, sometimes you walk in and there'll be a trash bucket on the floor collecting water that is falling through the ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
Teachers can't use the blackboard because there's it's been damaged from the water that's coming in. So there's a whole school of thought that the conditions you put a child in tell them something about their worth and their value and what's expected of them. That's why when you look at some of the schools in the inner city, people say, wow, look at the conditions you're sending these kids to. What do you think in the United States, right? Like, what do you think that they think when they're here? Of course, they're not going to perform as if they would like their peers in a more affluent district, down the road. So these conditions are sending a message too.
Mm.
Post the hurricane, it was even worse. I mean, you had huge cracks going through walls. You had
Mm-hmm.
foundation that had shifted. You had yellow tape that was sort of blocking off sections of that were unsafe or unsound to not so that the students wouldn't go there. I mean, that's not that's I don't think that that's acceptable. I think adults are responsible for providing better conditions than that for a child to go to school to learn.
Mm. So these were all things you noticed as soon as you had gotten there.
Mm-hmm. And people will
Yeah.
tell you, I mean, it's not everyone will tell you that it's like there are some schools that aren't like that, but most of the schools are.
Mm. And so a lot of this seems to be, I mean, the question is, why does a certain place, why did that exist to begin with? So, because I'm reflecting with some of the schools that I taught in India, and a lot of the conditions were very similar. I mean, in that sense. And so, but when I think about why that's the case, I think a lot of times the cities just didn't have the money, or there just wasn't the resources to build something better oftentimes.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think were some of the reasons why these conditions existed before you got there?
So the at one point Puerto Rico had five. I think it's because of the use of resources, the lack of strategic utilization and
Mm,
of resources and fiscal management. Period. Um, at one point, Puerto Rico had 500,000 students and 1,500 schools, and then you had a population decrease. So when I got there in 2017, there were 365,000 students, and we still had 1,350 schools.
mm,
So as a result, you had small concentrations of students in many schools, and then some concentrations with with larger, right? More on average, right? What your per pupil ratio would be in an average school in the United States, and in a a district on the mainland. So, um, but a lot of the buildings were in disrepair, and they had taken out bond. The government had taken out bonds on the buildings, but the repairs were never finished. Facilities management and the ownership of the buildings is not handled by the Department of Education. It's handled by two third-party agencies in the government. They split the schools. The older schools go to one, and the newer schools after 1950 go to another agency. So you have to have like a capital investment plan, right? Like you have to have like how a facilities management. You have to know what is the status of your buildings, what's the status of those systems, what kind of upgrades are needed regularly, and you have to allocate money to make sure that those upgrades happen. That's how it
Mm,
works normally.
mm,
But if there's no capital planning and there's no money set aside, and no one's accountable for actually doing the physical repairs on the building, then so that's the building part. And then the budget was the other problem in the department. So there weren't clear line items that would say books. How much is the department allocating to books this year? How much are we allocating to technology? Like that's why you to avoid that. Why does that problem exist? Because someone didn't prioritize what was going to be provided in terms of a good or a service, and then allocate resources to that. And if they determine that there weren't sufficient resources available, figure out where those resources were going to come from, or make trade-off decisions to take from one and put with another so that you had sufficient
mm.
funds to do it.
When you look at education from this scale, in some ways it is supposed to be run efficiently as if it was like a business in some ways, right? Like the to make sure that all of the things are aligned, like they are where they are. There's like
Mm-hmm.
accountability and making sure
Yeah,
everything's happening effectively. A lot of these practices I feel like are practiced by many of these large corporations as well. Otherwise, they just wouldn't be able to function.
correct.
And so when, you come into this situation, what was your thinking, connecting back to that systems thinking model? What was your thinking of like, where do we begin? What do we start with? Do we start with the buildings? Do we start with the playgrounds? Do we start with, where did you think about how did
Yeah.
you start?
So the in the first quarter that I was there, we set four goals for the organization, which was to improve student outcomes, to the second was to educate the whole child, because we haven't even touched on socio-emotional learning, the emotional health and psychological well-being, social work aspects, all of those other things that are equally important. But there was no program for that. Like in the States, there's a guidance counselor in every school, and if there's X number of students, and you get two guidance counselors, right? And there's an
Mm,
assistant principal in every school. And if you get X number of students, you get a second assistant principal. There's a school social worker, there's a school nurse. That infrastructure did not exist in Puerto Rico, which I found shocking, because I went into a classroom one time and there was a child who was sick. There was no nurse to send him to, and he was curled up in a ball. There was a little kid, who was like a first grader, on the teacher's seat. And I said, well, what is he doing now? He doesn't feel well. I would like to be to say that I'm committed to doing better than that. That a 5 or 6 year old child who's sick for whatever reason has a place to go to lay down and to see a nurse. And that nurse can call his mom, or they can figure out but not leave him on the teacher's chair in the middle of the classroom.
mm.
So sorry. So how did I figure out what? So the whole child, right? Which that would be included.
Yeah.
And then professionalize the education, the teachers, being an educator in Puerto Rico, give that respect, give that compensation, invest in professional development. And the fourth one was to right size the system, because we needed to and we didn't have enough money to operate 1,300 schools. I didn't really have a choice about prioritizing buildings or not. When the hurricane came, they took care of that. That wasn't, buildings just became an issue post Maria. But I think that was the first step. You say, okay, what are the goals? And then inside of each of those buckets, right? What are we going to do to improve the outcomes? Number one, okay, books. That's a pretty simple one, right? Um, Computers, because it allows you to, and technology, because it allows you to differentiate the instruction and give diverse experiences to students. Three, the getting a teacher for the students, because there would be students who would go for 2 or 3 years with no math teacher. They would go for 2 or 3 years. So when they're in third grade and they had a math teacher, there's no fourth or fifth grade math teacher in their school. They don't see a math teacher again until they get to sixth grade.
Mm,
So let's put a teacher. Let's make sure that there's a teacher in every school. So
mm,
those would be like sort of the priorities. And then for the socio-emotional one, we prioritized hiring that kind of support staff. So in each of those buckets, right? And then if you go back to the Bronfenbrenner thing about the concentric circles, as you're moving each of these pieces, you can't stand all of it up at once, but increment, you can do the easy things first. So
yeah.
getting a book there, that's great. And then moving the teachers, hiring new staff. So you can transform an environment by sequencing the steps. But in order to do that, we needed to reallocate the money from where it was going to other things. And then we also decentralized the system. So instead of there being one secretary that we go to ask, we made 7 regional superintendents. And that
Mm,
disrupted the political structure, and it also placed the accountable party closer to the families who were sending their children to that school. Because if a person in Rincon needed to get to somebody in San Juan to be able to express that's probably going to be more challenging than if there was a regional office where that person could drive maybe an hour or two to be able to sit down with the superintendent who was there and talk about what they needed. Superintendents could
mm,
also then go visit and drive to visit the 200 or some schools that were in that district. This is just rationalizing or normalizing the design to reflect how, and it's not that I'm a genius. I'm replicating what you look to. How does New York City work? How does Chicago work? How does Miami work? How does LA work? That this is how the design is built. So I was just
mm,
trying to shift it towards something that is proven to be a manageable structure.
mm. So one of the decisions that had like a lot of kind of mixed responses to and people were quite upset about was the closing of a lot of schools.
Mm-hmm.
And so you talked a lot about how, I think the example that you had brought up earlier, how there were some schools that had a lot of people, which were just significantly better funded, and other schools that just had such few students,
Mm-hmm.
and weren't funded. And so to move those students to one of those other schools,
Mm-hmm.
to me, to some extent makes sense. And so I'm curious, why do you think people responded in some ways negatively to those decisions?
Mm-hmm.
And how did you kind of go about that process? In the midst of all that.
Um, so I think that um, I approached it with a lot of curiosity, like what's going on here, and a lot of sort of being a little bit sort of skeptical. So like, how does this work? Like, how can this work? Like, how? Like, I just don't understand how this works. How does this work? We don't have enough money or people to be able to staff all of these schools. So make this, somebody make this make sense. So we did a review of all of the schools, every one of the 1,300 schools, based on, and there's a set of criteria that we published: the age of the building, the amount of the bond debt that was on it, the amount of repairs that it needed, the student population, the number of teachers, the proximity to other schools. Because in some instances, you literally had like within 3 blocks, 3 walking blocks in Arecibo, you had 3 schools. But
Mm,
at some point, Puerto Rico had enough children to fill those schools, right? It wasn't bad that there were 3. It was just that the conditions had changed. And previous leadership hadn't right sized incrementally. So the task that was in front of me was much larger because so many things hadn't been done previously. So we had these criteria. And each of the 7 superintendents went through their list. They conducted school visits, and they made a recommendation of which would be the schools to consolidate. How would we move students from one place to another? And so it was a measured. I mean, I don't know how I strike you, but I am methodical and I am data driven and I am rational, to a fault, right? It's got to be logical and make sense. So then they produced the numbers. We did the analysis of the budgets and the schools and what would the future state look like and what would a child get if we did this shift. How many teachers could we put there? Would it be equitable? Because normally in states, there's a per pupil funding formula.
Mm-hmm.
There's the amount of money that the state will allocate for each child. And then there's the local contribution. But in Puerto Rico, you don't have a local contribution because there's no property taxes.
Mm.
So the total budget is really just what the feds provide and what the state gives. And that was a total of 3.5 billion. So we worked the numbers, and I went out to different communities with my slide, and I talked about it, and I, with a very rational, I don't know, pragmatic, you know, business-like approach of what is the justification for what I'm proposing, right? Like, I owe you, public, an explanation for why I'm doing what I'm doing. Here are the numbers. I believe in the numbers, and I believe in what this change is going to get us in terms of better conditions. And I went about it all wrong. That is not what I should have done.
Mm.
How do I know that? It didn't work. And people felt hurt in the process. People felt like they weren't listened to. People felt like they didn't have any agency. Communities mourned the loss of schools that had been there for 100 years, that their grandmothers and great grandmother had gone to, that they have had, celebrations of, that held the names of the most respected leaders in Puerto Rican history. And I closed those schools. I took that away. And I was behaving in a way that was so vastly different than what any previous leader had done. And it was, I think, offensive in a lot of ways. It was shocking to the conscience. It was scary. And my mistake was over focusing on the practical details of the problem I was trying to solve and not considering the human experience of solving that problem. So alternatives
Mm.
could have looked like closing fewer schools over the same amount of schools, but over a longer period of years. Versus taking the approach of like, let's get it done. And then you have like, if you do it all in 2 years, and that's the bad part, every year after the second year is going to be a good year because you can see it's getting better. Versus, a little bit here in year one, a little bit more in year two, a little bit more in year three. And by year 4, year 5, people are like, man, is she ever going to be done closing these schools? Like, this is like death by 1,000 paper cuts. But really, the question I ask myself is, would that have been more palatable? Would that have been more tolerable for the change? And then, I think the unions relocating the teachers created a challenge. But my goal, again, was to make sure that every child had a teacher for all of the core subject that they needed to have. So there were a lot of competing interests that, while I recognized, I didn't attend to sufficiently.
Mm. I mean, I think, when I first wanted to become a data scientist, I remember we took this ethics class and it was just a period of reflection for me where I realized sometimes when you're working at such a large scale, people become data points or numbers and it's hard to remember that you're working with people. I think like I think that example you gave earlier is so important in many different areas of the being in the party and observing the party. I think as
Mm-hmm,
a policymaker, analyst, I think this happens all the time where you start to watch the party, but you're no longer with the
mm-hmm,
people.
mm-hmm,
You're no longer one
mm-hmm.
of the people, and you
Right,
forget that each data point is a real life human who has emotions and feelings
right.
and can
Yep.
feel deeply about some of the decisions that we take. So now when now that you still work in a lot of these similar things and you work on solving a lot of these problems, how do you approach it differently now?
I think, failure and making mistakes is an incredible opportunity to learn. And you know, our human experience, our journey in life, we're presented with so many different things that we haven't seen before. And I like to think people do their best. I at least try to do my best in a situation. And so, I I wish that I didn't give people the negative experience that I did, and so I keep that present. It was never my intent, and so I feel badly about it because it was like an unintentional harm, right? So
Hmm.
it was I had to I was trying to do good, but it wound up giving people a negative experience. And so I keep those experiences and the amazing growth that I've had um, from the lessons that I learned in Puerto Rico with me. And I do try to approach the work differently. Um,
Mm.
we learn from our mistakes. Somebody said, like, I've never learned anything from a success, but I learned so much from all of my failures, you know? And so I think I have a lot more um, humility and understanding and sensitivity to others, maybe less inclined to drive forward, to push an agenda forward. My mistake also too was like having a sense of urgency. Like, how much longer were the children really going to wait for somebody to come in and do something, you
Mm.
know? And did I feel okay with that? But I could have collaborated with people. I could have shared that burden differently. And I'm glad that I know that I realize that now, because that can shape, how I present myself and how I work with others in the future. And I think it's
Mm.
important for education leaders to, like, you don't have to, the expectation is that we're not like superhuman. We don't get everything all right all the time.
All the
I
time.
think the humility of accepting that we made a mistake, or we wish we would have done something different, or we regret that someone was harmed. I think those make us better human beings in and of ourselves.
Yeah, I strongly believe that and hope that as well. So, in 2019 there was the Hurricane Maria had happened and it added an extra strain on the economy and on schools. I mean, you talk about the buildings, you talk about funding and just the mental state of students and people in general. And so this was during the time where you went through several legal issues and you had pleaded not guilty and the legal battles became like a focal point of media coverage and public discourse. I'm
Hmm.
kind of really curious to just hear what that experience was like. Um, going through it, kind of, you had felt that you were not guilty of the things that were being put on you, which were related to fraud and corruption. And what was that kind of journey like? And yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. So from 17, when I got there, the first round of school closings happened in May. There were also we I removed some political appointees who um, weren't the best fit for the role that they were in, their responsibility. Then in September, the hurricane happened. So it was pretty tough um, through December. By January, the schools had opened again by October. My preference would have been to allow FEMA to just fully assess the conditions and keep them closed so that we could get full funding for the buildings that should have, really what conditions should look like the kinds of learning environment students should have. Then in March of 18, we passed the Education Reform Act, right? So that bill, which pretty much codified all of the reforms that had been implemented for the last, 18 months, um, no, 15 months. And then then May happened and we did the second round of school closing. So you can see that's a pretty fast clip for, at that point it was 12 plus that, at that point it was 18 months. So two rounds
Mm.
of school closings, a hurricane, a new education reform bill, and then the next year, right? It was a lot. It was a lot for people to process. Um, and then we started the next school year, and I had asked for what I think that they needed. I think their budget shouldn't be 3.5 billion. It should be at least 5.5 billion, and it should really be 7.5 because we've got a lot of catch up to do, right? So, but I think they're still at the same number that they always were with fewer students. But anyway, so I asked for more money, and we started the school year, and then there was a lot of I think at that point people um uh, the level of frustration with me and the reforms that I was driving was really reaching its pinnacle. And there was a lot of sensationalized news coverage. I mean, you're just really sort of just under fire all the time. Protests in front of the department. I mean, it was just really, people were like, kind of, what is she doing? And so I started to feel like it was untenable for me to stay. I was ready to go at the end of like December of 18. I stayed and finalized all of sort of the setting the table activities with the budget and the teacher professional development and the salary scale and all of that. And then in April, I resigned. And then the indictment happened in July of 19. And my goal was to hand over, to set it up, right? Like, well, we implement all the reforms. Let's put the systems and the processes in place, and let's put a new leader in, because people are kind of tired of me and what I've disrupted. And so let's give the reins to someone else who people can relate more to, who's going to have a different style, and then they can implement. So that was in April, and then in July is when the indictment happened. And it was, it was what I just described of those, 28 months was very intense, but it was nothing compared to what the experience of being in the crosshairs of the federal government is. Paled entirely by comparison. And being indicted, and officials knocking on your door at 5 o'clock in the morning is a terrifying and life-altering experience. And it only, for the next 2.5 years, it got worse from there. So the immediate, one of the interesting things that, and I'm sure you've heard this, right? That one of the tenets of the American criminal justice system is innocent until
proven guilty.
But that's actually not how it works. So by and large, the immediate public reaction to my indictment was that I was guilty. And I learned a lot from that. It's the criminal legal system has a lot of flaws, but really American citizens are guaranteed a right of the presumption of innocence until proven guilty by a jury trial. That's how it's supposed to work. And the jury trial plays a very important role in American criminal justice, in that it validates, and it is served as the only sort of populist check on the branches of government. So July of 2019 is where I began to really understand how our criminal justice system works or doesn't, depending on how you look at it.
And to this day, do you, I'm trying to think about how to kind of, like, if you can kind of explain a little bit about what happened in terms of the actual case itself.
Sure.
Yeah. What was it that they were? Yeah.
So the first indictment, there were three. The first indictment was one charge of conspiracy and 8 charges of wire fraud. So if I say wire fraud to you, what does that mean? What do you think it is? What is it?
Okay, I'm gonna guess. My guess
what
is,
notion comes to mind?
yeah, you can have money wired to you. So I'm assuming it has something to do with getting money instead of like cash or something, have money wired to
Great.
you.
No. So wire fraud is the contemporary corollary to mail fraud. Mail fraud is if you mail something through the U.S. postal system that is fraudulent in some way. It's a lie. It's intended to deceive. Wire fraud means that you used electronic communication, or wires, to send the communication, not stamped mail. So there's no transfer of money. Wire fraud doesn't mean wire from like a bank wire. It means the internet was used, and that's why it was an email. So I sent an email. Those 8 other charges of wire fraud corresponded to 8 emails. And the reason it was a federal case is because the wires are going outside of the locality where you are.
Mm.
It's not about federal funds. It's not about a federal grant. It was about wire fraud, which is sending of an email. So that was the first one. I'll give it, just in the interest of time, I'll give you the other two. So that case transformed itself 13 months later when the Department of Justice dropped all of those charges and issued what's called a superseding indictment. This one had 24 charges, new charges, different charges, including aggravated identity theft. Same basis situation. The facts and the conditions had not changed. In the first instance, looking at that situation A, they charged me with 1 count of conspiracy and 8 counts of wire fraud, sending emails. 13 months later, subsequent to a Supreme Court decision that affirmed what had been precedent, they charge again, this time with the 24 counts, 2 of which are now aggravated identity theft. Which, what does that make you think of? That I stole someone's identity.
Yeah.
And I did something, right? I wrote a check. I used a credit card. I did, right? These are 2 very, very different descriptions of the same situation A. So that's that one. And then in the middle of that, in January of 2020, there was what was the second case that related to, was called honest services fraud. And there the charges that I misused my position for some kind of gain. Related, completely unrelated to the first 2 instances. It was related to the purchase of a condo. So it was very complicated for the public, and the judge had issued a gag order at responding to the request from the prosecution, which prohibited me from speaking about the facts of those 3 cases in public to provide any explanation to anyone publicly who might want to know what was going on. But none of the cases involved any loss to the Puerto Rico Department of Education. There was never an allegation that I took money from the department, that the budget was compromised in some way, that I paid for something that I wasn't supposed to, that I gave money to someone that I wasn't supposed to, that I paid money for work that they didn't do. None of those things were related to the case. It's fascinating.
So that took up almost 2.5 years of your life, and then it just ended with, I mean, you know what's interesting? I feel like in context of time, there's so much more to get into, which I feel like is really important. Like, because the story doesn't end here. I mean, there's a lot of work that you did when you were in prison for those 6 months, where you were working again with education and with a lot of the people who were in prison with you, and you continued to work and understand more about the prison system and some of the difficulties on it. And then it leads you to the work that you're doing now, and how you're still involved in education. I think we might have to do a part 2.
Yeah, so I think there's definitely more to the story. There's definitely more to the story, but it really all ends well, and really I again connected to the Puerto Rican community when I went to Alderson, and the classes that I taught, were with students who were from Puerto Rico. So it's an amazing journey that has been quite circuitous.
Yeah. And I mean, it's just there's so much more. I'm really excited to kind of get into, um, I mean, the experiences of what it was like to be inside prison and understand education from that perspective, and to then, come out and have to like reform and change, kind of rebuild your life again in many ways after having such a tumultuous decade almost. And so, yeah, I'm excited. I do want to ask you more, but thank you so much for, coming today and sharing all that you had to say. And I'm really glad to have gotten your side of the story, and to hear about the things that you've learned along the way.
And thank you so much for the opportunity and for your very thoughtful questions.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day, And as per usual, stay re-educated.